follow in the footsteps of Vermuyden. Engineered by Cornelius Vermuyden in the 1600s, the drainage systems of the Bedford level have stood the test of time, keeping the surrounding farmlands and communities safe from floods and tides. Straight channels drained the Fenland waters and embankments created washlands to store the floods. This system has changed and evolved over time, but its fundamental purpose remains today. I'm just going to give you a quick reminder of the geography and a recap of the history of the great drainage schemes of the 17th century before we dive into a little bit more about some of the civil engineers associated with the management of water in the Fens and how we manage that system today. So this map is a map created by Thomas Baddeslade in 1723. We may have seen this before on one of our Fascinating Fens presentations, so do bear with me. You'll note that the direction on this map showing north is actually to the right-hand side. So the wash is here on the right-hand side of the map. And we have Norfolk and Suffolk down in the south. And then we move round to Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire and Lincolnshire, with the area known as Holland just down here at the bottom of the wash. We can see from the map that the rivers that crossed the Fenland took quite a winding and tortuous route. So this is the River Nene here, running through the Whittlesea Mere, Ugg Mere, Ramsey Mere, eventually coming out to an outfall at Salter's Lode on the River Ouse. And then here we have the River Great Ouse flowing down from Huntingdon, down past Ely, joining with the Nene and eventually outfalling to the wash. You'll also notice this very straight line here, which is Morton's Lean. And there'll be more about that a little bit later. So in the 1600s, the General Drainage Act was passed by Parliament, and this paved the way for large-scale drainage projects. A few years later, the Lynn Law effectively created an agreement between Francis, the 4th Earl of Bedford, and the Commissioners of Sewers to enable a drainage scheme to be carried out in the Fens. So now we move to Baddeslade's map, showing what the Fens looked like after the drainage. So again, orientated with north to the right, the wash to the right-hand side. And along the edge of Morton's Lean, there's now a second straight line, which was known as Smith's Lean. And these two rivers, together with embankments, created a washland, which today we call Whittlesea or Nene Washes. And further round to the bottom of the map, or to the east, the Old Bedford River and the New Bedford River, creating the Ouse Washes. Now, the creation of this network of drains and rivers effectively split the Great Level, or the Bedford level, into 3 administrative areas, with North Level in the north, Middle Level in the middle, unsurprisingly, and the South Level in the southeast. Now, the drainage of the Fens was actually nothing new by the 17th century. The Romans were actually the first ones to carry out some drainage, primarily to catch water falling off the higher grounds of the Lincolnshire Wolds and Northamptonshire. And they also dug some channels, which we believe were used for navigation. The most famous of their drainage ditches, it was probably the Carr Dyke, which was actually dug all the way down from Lincoln to the River Nene at Peterborough. And of course, there are plenty of historic coastal flood banks called, and you'll often find banks called Roman Bank, which probably gives us a bit of a clue. And before the dissolution of the monasteries, the Fenland abbeys, Thorney Abbey, Ramsey, Ely, and so on, were the ones who undertook the drainage, looked after the rivers and the embankments. And in 1480, Bishop Morton, who was the Bishop of Ely, and also head of the Commissioners of the Isle, who were responsible for management of the rivers and the banks at that time, Morton cut a straight channel from Stanground to Guyherne in order to try and get rid of the water from the River Nene a little bit quicker and make a more direct route to the sea. Morton actually built a tower at Guyherne so that he could watch the progress of this piece of work. And that apparently was still standing until around 1810. So the River Nene, before the Morton's Lane was cut, took quite a long route down to the sea. This map isn't quite complete, but you can see Peterborough up on the left-hand side here and the little island that had Thorney Abbey on it. And the route of the River Nene came down across the middle here to the south of Whittlesea Mere, past Benwick, through March, and eventually discharged into the River Ouse at Salter's Lode. Now, the majority of this route remains, but with the beginning of Morton's Lane, the practice of straight artificial rivers became the basis for all subsequent drainage work in the Fens. Now, from this period until the 17th century, not a great deal happens, just small-scale works undertaken under the jurisdiction of the Commissioners of Sewers. But in 1600, as I mentioned, the General Drainage Act paved the way for large-scale drainage projects. And in 1630, the agreement between the Earl of Bedford and his adventurers and the Commissioners of Sewers enabled the commencement of that great drainage scheme. A further agreement the following year, known as the Indenture of 14 Parts, defined the payments to the adventurers as a share of the drained land. So once the land was drained, they would get a share of this. And so began the drainage of the Great Level, Phase 1. And it was during this period that the Old Bedford River was cut. 6 years later, at a court in St Ives, the Commissioners for Sewers declared that the adventurers had fulfilled their contract and they received 95,000 acres of land in payment. But in 1939, so just 3 years later, this law was repealed and the adventurers lost their land. And this was primarily due to the fact that there was still winter inundation, so the land could only be used for summer grazing. So this chap, Vermuyden, the Dutch engineer, he was very well connected, although it doesn't necessarily mean that he was very popular. But in 1642, he published his discourse touching the drainage of the Great Fens. And this was written for his sponsor, mentor, call it what you like, Charles I in 1637. Vermuyden's approach was to include some innovative ideas to drain the Fenland. And these included the creation of the washlands and digging a catchwater drain, which we'll hear a bit more about later. Now, as a civil engineer, I find the following fact quite fascinating. The institution has a huge archive of historical documents, papers, drawings, around 130,000 titles in their archive. And Vermuyden's discourse is the earliest engineering report in that collection. So following the publishing of this report, Vermuyden was appointed by Charles to carry out the second phase of the drainage of the Great Level. And this included building a bank north of Morton's Lane, a south barrier bank, and a sluice at Stanground. And collectively, these then formed what we now know as the Whittlesea Washes. But of course, then the English Civil War broke out and work essentially halted on the drainage schemes. But Oliver Cromwell took quite an interest in drainage, and he then continued to champion Vermuyden and support the drainage works. So it seems that Vermuyden didn't really have any loyalties either way. I suspect as long as he was being paid, he was quite happy. After the Civil War, a new contract was drawn up between the Society of Adventurers and Vermuyden. And it was at this point that he dug the new Bedford River, built a sluice at Denver to keep out the tidal waters where the old and new Bedford rivers joined the Great Ouse. And so the drainage work was completed. But a new authority was needed to maintain the rivers and embankments and sluices and to look after the navigational interests. So in 1663, an organisation called the Bedford Level Corporation was created under a very grand sounding act entitled An Act for Settling the Drainage of the Great Level of the Fens, called Bedford Level. And that was at the point at which Bedford Level was split into the administrative areas of North, Middle and South. But the story didn't stop there. Works still continued, and in 1728, the Bedford Level Corporation completed the cut of Smith's Lean, which is in the North Level. And this effectively replaced Morton's Lean, diverting all of the River Nene discharge down to Guyherne to outfall at Wisbeach. And this also improved navigation. And of course, this river is what, as we know today, as the continuation of the River Nene from Peterborough to Guyherne. There were many challenges that the engineers had to contend with, and in 1713, Denver Sluice collapsed under the pressure of flood flows coming downriver, meeting a surge tide coming up the river from the Wash. And it wasn't until 30 years later that a Swiss engineer called Charles Labelai actually rebuilt Denver Sluice. And this is a photo of his rather fabulous looking engineering drawing, which is held in the Cambridgeshire Archives. And now we come on to some particularly eminent civil engineers associated with the Fens, some of whom were presidents of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And most of them are well known for other works, but perhaps not so well known for the work that they did in the Fens. John Smeaton, who was famous for his Eddystone Lighthouse, amongst other things, wrote a report concerning the drainage of the north level of the Fens and the outfall of the Wisbeach River in 1768. John Rennie, who was particularly well known for his canals and waterways across the country, produced a report in 1809 on the deficiencies in the Great Level system. But it's really his son, Sir John Rennie, who was particularly prevalent in undertaking projects in the Fens. And in 1829, he carried out a second North Level improvement scheme along with Thomas Telford, who was the first president of the ICE. 5 years later, Sir John reconstructed Denver Sluice. And a few years after that, he proposed draining the western part of the middle level, the area around the Whittlesea Mere, taking the water by Bevil's Lean along the 20-foot river to the River Nene at Guyherne. And his intention was to improve the drainage and hopefully to drain the water from Whittlesea Mere. But at the time, his proposal was rejected. In 1842, James Walker, another president of the ICE, proposed a cut from Whittlesea Mere to St Germans. His intention was to improve the outfall into the Great Ouse because the tide mark was lower at St Germans than at the original outfall at Salter's Lode. And thus, in 1848, the middle level main drain was completed, providing a gravity discharge to the tidal River Ouse through a sluice at St Germans. However, that sluice collapsed 15 years later, and Sir John Hawkshaw rebuilt the sluice at St Germans in 1878. There are still signs of this old structure in place, and it is still known as the Hawkshaw Sluice today. So I mentioned earlier on Vermuyden's proposal for a catchwater drain in his discourse of 1642. And John Rennie, 200 years later, also proposed a similar construction. But it wasn't until the 1950s that a relief channel and cut-off channel, effectively designed around the basis originally proposed by Vermuyden, was actually constructed, and it was designed by Sir Murdoch MacDonald and Partners, based in Cambridge. And the construction of this channel was really prompted by the devastating floods of 1947. And the purpose of the catchwater drain was to effectively catch water falling from the high ground of Norfolk and Suffolk. And the relief channel, which runs down from Denver to King's Lynn, serves as an additional route for floodwaters, relieving the tidal ooze. But of course, all of this work had unintended consequences. And it's highly unlikely that Vermuyden and his Dutch colleagues, who undertook the initial drainage schemes, could have anticipated the shrinkage of the peat. The challenges and approaches to manage drainage and flooding evolved over time as the peat shrunk. The ground surrounding the rivers fell, and the rivers had to be embanked and the water pumped up into these high level channels. Wind pumps were used originally, and of course over time they evolved to run with steam, diesel, and eventually electric. So all of that work that was carried out has left us with an extremely complex system of rivers, drains, humps, sluices, and locks. And the map here focuses particularly on the middle level. We have the River Nene along the northern edge and the Whittlesea Washes. To the east, we have the Old and New Bedford rivers and the Ouse Washes sitting between them. The red line shows the catchment boundary of the middle level. And the middle level system is created with the thick blue lines. And these are primarily the large embanked rivers that you see as you drive across the Fens. The smaller network of drains that you can see are small catchments which are then pumped up into the middle level system. This system is really carefully controlled, and we use pumping stations and sluices to manage the water levels. And there are also quite a lot of navigation locks to allow navigation along the River Nene, the Great Ouse, and also along the middle level system. But the existence and the success of this system wouldn't be possible without all the organisations that look after the rivers and their structures today. Now, from about 1810 to the early 1900s, many acts were passed by Parliament to give authorities powers and responsibilities to undertake drainage and navigation works in the Fens, and to enable them to levy taxes to fund the work that was needed to keep them in working order. Prior to the great drainage schemes of the 17th century, the commissioners of sewers oversaw the drainage arrangements. But in 1663, the Bedford Level Corporation was created and took over to maintain the drains and embankments and sluices. Subsequent acts set up local commissioners with powers to raise taxes for the maintenance. And these included acts that created the middle level commissioners, and that separated the middle level from the Bedford Level Corporation. Then the North Level Act incorporated the Mean Level Commissioners, and so on and so on. Today, there are many organisations that look after the water management, flood management in the Fens. And two of the key acts that they work under are the Land Drainage Act and the more recent Flood and Water Management Act. But there are many more with which these organisations have to comply. But if you thought the water network was complex, the organisations which look after them can be even more confusing. Today we're called Flood Risk Management Authorities, and we sit under the umbrella of DEFRA. The main rivers, so the River Nene and the River Great Ouse, are looked after by the Environment Agency. Ordinary watercourses within the area of the Bedford levels are looked after by internal drainage boards. And where there isn't an internal drainage board, ordinary watercourses are looked after by the local authorities. But there are also lots of other authorities that have permissive powers and duties when it comes to managing flood risk in particular. And these include water and sewerage companies, the highways authorities, and of course the Canal and River Trust when it comes to navigation. So although flooding to most of us is a bit of a nuisance, stop us getting to work, it can unfortunately flood our houses in some cases. There are so many different organisations, it's sometimes quite difficult to find your way through these. Something else that we have to have a regard for nowadays, not just getting the water away. We have to think about managing the water for the environment, for conservation purposes, for water resources, and also for navigation.
I'm just going to talk on drainage.
It's very doubtful that Vermuyden and his successors had much regard for the impacts of work on the natural and historical environment, or indeed the health and safety of their workers and the public. The work in the 17th century would have been very hard, very labour intensive, and extremely unsafe. And of course, there was no heavy earth moving machinery available. All the work would have been carried out with men with wheelbarrows and spades, and very little else. But the features of the Fens are an incredible testament to those people and to the engineers. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the old and new Bedford rivers, which create the Ouse Washes. So the Ouse Washes, as I've already said, sits on the eastern side of the Bedford level. And the project that I was involved with at the Environment Agency consisted of raising the middle level barrier bank for its whole 30-kilometre length from Erith down to Salters Lode. So in order to undertake a project of this size, a lot of planning is involved. First of all, we had to set up a team of specialists, engineers, surveyors, ecologists, and so on, carry out a number of surveys. And of course, most of you know that the Ouse Washes is particularly important for its environmental designations. So carrying out a project on such an important and sensitive site was even more challenging. So the first few years of the project was actually gathering data, understanding what the site conditions were like, developing the design, and putting contracts in place to do the work. So we started working in 2017. And the project took 6 years to complete. And during that time, I think nature threw just about everything at us that it possibly could do. We had 2 years under which we had to work under COVID restrictions. We had the highest water level in the Ouse Washes for 20 years. And we had the hottest and driest summer on record. And all of these things created some significant challenges for us, but not least because of the environmental sensitivities. We could only work for 16 weeks every summer. The main purpose of the project was, as I said, to raise the middle level barrier bank. And in order to do this, we had to, as is shown on the cross section here, we had to cut steps into the embankment, import clay, place and compact the clay, put the topsoil back, and then grass seed the bank. So now that all the work is completed, you wouldn't actually know any difference. But the driver for this project was effectively to avoid a situation like this, to avoid a breach in the bank, such as this one that occurred, and I believe this one is at Over, in 1947. I did promise Karen that I would try and explain why you always see a group of engineers standing around looking in a hole. I couldn't find a hole, but I found a group of engineers standing around chatting. So before we started construction, we have to cut the grass, remove the excessive vegetation, and then we can strip the topsoil. So the topsoil is stored on site and then put back on after the construction works have been completed. So this means that we don't have to import any topsoil, and also it means that we retain the seed bank. And that's quite important, particularly on an environmentally sensitive site such as the Ouse Washes. We also had to strengthen the haul road at the toe of the embankment so that we could bring the lorries in with the clay. We brought in a significant amount of material over the 6 years of working. But what we did manage to do was to bring 50% of those lorries directly from the quarry onto site, keeping them off the local roads. Once the clay is brought to site, it's placed and compacted in layers. You can see the little bobbles here in the clay produced by the sheep's foot roller, and that basically knits the layers of the clay together to create a stable bank. There are actually very few people on site. We had a couple of gangs of machine operators and all of the delivery lorries, but the majority of the work is actually carried out by using GPS. So we have very little health and safety concerns in relation to the interaction between people and heavy machinery. We do have a few people on site, of course, though, and one of the important things in a project like this was to carry out testing of the material. We have very particular specification for this type of works, and we carried out many tests on the soil, testing its moisture content, which is related to the ability to compact it properly. So just another picture here showing the number of plant on site. And if you can see on the dozer here, these two little bubbles either side of the blade, those are the GPS receivers. And so they help guide the blade to get the right level of fill on the embankment. Slightly more high-tech than Vermuyden would have had. And here's the sheep's foot roller, compacting the final layer of clay on the crest of the embankment. So once the embankment has been built up, the topsoil is placed back on, bladed off, ready for grass seeding. In some places, we had to put some hard engineering erosion protection on the embankment, and this is an example of some concrete blocks that we have used. And in other areas, we used a softer solution to provide a temporary bank stabilisation consisting of a Hessian matting, some of which comes impregnated with grass seed, and some of which we put grass seed on afterwards. And this basically allows the grass to grow through, to knit together, and the Hessian eventually biodegrades. And we repeated those processes for 30 kilometres and 6 very long summers. But the work was worth it, and in the end we have a lovely new raised bank with a good grass cover, which is hopefully going to last for another 20 years or so. And I say that because obviously we know there's a lot of peat in the Fens, and any heavy structure such as a clay bank like this is susceptible to settlement over time. So the Environment Agency will continue to monitor the bank crest levels and top it up as necessary. This just shows some lovely wildflower mixes in the grass seed down at the bottom of the bank. And this is one of the reasons why we reused the topsoil, retaining that seed bank, and it doesn't actually take very long at all to re-establish. Now, of course, some of the other features of the washes includes the Welney Causeway, and where the road goes over the middle level barrier bank at Welney, it creates a low spot in the bank. So when we did the bank raising works, we had to provide a solution to protect that low spot in times when the water level in the Ouse Washes is particularly high. The solution we came up with was a demountable barrier that's put in across the road when the water level reaches a certain trigger level. And this was quite a significant amount of work. As you can see, we had to shut the road for a period of time so that we could construct a concrete slab across the road, onto which we would eventually fit the posts for the demountable barrier. And this is the demountable barrier being fitted for the first time, just to make sure that all the bolt holes are in the right place before the rest of the road is reinstated. And we also carried out a testing and training session for the operatives in the Environment Agency who will fit the barrier in as and when needed. So now I'm going to take a look at the middle level. As I said before, the middle level system consists of these raised embanked watercourses, which take the water down out of the system and down to a pumping station at St Germans. There's a second pumping station at Bevil's Leam, which lifts water out of the lowest lying areas of the fen, which of course is located around the old Whittlesea Mere. Within the middle level system, there are smaller areas which are pumped up into the main rivers. And if I just zoom in to the area of Benwick, we can see how the network of drainage is arranged within this area, controlled by one of the very many internal drainage boards. So their system of drains connect together to a series of pumping stations dotted around the district, lifting the water up, in this case, into the 40-foot drain, or Vermuyden's drain, along the southern edge, or into the course of the old River Nene, which runs along the top through Benwick. And here we can see the 6 pumping stations of the Benwick I.D.B district. Now, in order to maintain this system, lots of different activities have to be undertaken, and I just picked out some of my favourite photographs here of activities being done through the ages. The top left-hand photograph shows some piling works being done on the old River Nene. This is using a piling rig powered by a diesel generator. Down in the bottom left-hand photograph, very similar work, but in this case, this was in around 1910, and the piling rig is actually driven by a little steam engine floating on the barge here. The photograph in the bottom right-hand picture is a weed harvester taken in the 1970s. And this piece of machinery basically cuts the weeds out of the drain to improve the conveyance of the flow. And back up to the top right-hand corner here is a photo of workers working in the drain at Stanground Sluice. An interesting thing about this photograph is that it actually shows the old Stanground lockkeeper's house. Today, the lockkeeper's house is on the left-hand side of the photograph. I mentioned that the middle level main drain was cut to take the water down to a gravity outfall at St Germans. But in 1848, because of the shrinkage of the peat and the need to start pumping water, the gravity sluice outfall stopped working. And eventually a pumping station was built in 1934. And here it is, sitting at the end of the main drain. But after the Easter 1998 floods, a study was undertaken and identified that a new pumping station needed to be constructed. And the new St Germans pumping station came online in 2010 and is the largest pumping station of its kind in the UK. It has a discharge capacity of up to 100 cubic metres per second. And it contains 6 pumps which are powered by electricity, but each one also has a backup diesel generator. Because of the size of the pumps, only 3 pumps can run at any one time on mains electricity. The pumping station cost £40 million to build, and it protects 100,000 people and 26,000 properties from flooding within the middle level system. Photograph down in the bottom shows the old pumping station and the new pumping station being constructed. And while it was being constructed, the drain was diverted around the edge of the pumping station. And here is a photograph of the pumps inside. You can just see pumps 1, 2 and 3. And quite interestingly, each pump has been given a name. There's a little name plaque on each of those pumps. And some pictures of some more modern day reed harvesting boats here at work on the middle level. So they are used to cut the reeds that grow along the edges of the watercourse, and the banks are cut primarily using tractor flails. The middle level is a navigation, and there are a number of locks on the system, and these have to be repaired and maintained as well. And one of the main things with the locks is to keep the locks and the paddles operating, keep them well oiled, and to repair or replace the gates as and when needed. So with such a complex system and so many demands on water, as water management, risk management authorities, we have some really significant challenges ahead of us. Climate change is going to result in more volatile weather patterns. We're going to have hotter, drier seasons, more pronounced heavy rainfall. The loss of the peat from the fens is a significant contributor to carbon release. And of course, activities such as pumping are also very costly and also have an associated carbon footprint with them as well. The impacts of our activities in the Fenland area on the environment and on biodiversity has, of course, been quite profound. And there are lots of initiatives at the moment, such as the Great Fen, restoring wetland habitat. There are currently trials looking at alternative farming methods, looking at how the peat that we do still have in the fens can be conserved. And as risk management authorities, we are ever adapting and changing to how we manage the water. Vermuyden and the great engineers left us with a great legacy. But I do wonder what it will look like in another 350 years.